He had it all: money, power, fame. He was the face of a billion-dollar empire. But that morning, a single phone call dragged him back to the past, to the woman he loved, lost, and never forgot. It was the reunion that would change his life forever. James Mitchell never stopped. He hardly even breathed. His day was timed down to the minute between meetings, international calls, and multi-million-dollar decisions. He was the face of Mitchell Group, the holding company that moved billions in investments, infrastructure, and technology. Cold, direct, brilliant. He won, even when he lost. That Tuesday morning, he was leading a major merger between two logistics companies. From the top floor of headquarters, with a view of all Los Angeles, his mind was locked on the final signature of a contract that would put his name on yet another business magazine cover. His phone vibrated. Twice. He ignored it. The third time, he squinted and answered, annoyed. The voice on the other end wasn't from the market. It was a nurse. "Mr. James Mitchell? Your name is listed as the emergency contact for Olivia Bennett. She was in a car accident. She's at St. Mary's Hospital. Olivia." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hung up without replying, stood up without explanation, and left the meeting room stunned. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and urgency. James walked in wearing a tailored suit that stood out in the setting, but his eyes were different. For the first time in years, there was no control there. At reception, he gave Olivia's name. The attendant guided him to the ICU waiting room. The doctor showed up minutes later. "She's stable but unconscious, mild head trauma, 2 fractured ribs. She was lucky. The boy who was with her is fine, unharmed." "Boy?" he repeated. "Yes, her son." James frowned, unable to process. "Where is he?" "Right there, with one of the nurses. Do you want me to bring him?" Before he could answer, footsteps sounded behind him. When he turned, he saw the boy standing just a few feet away. Messy hair, big brown eyes, curious and familiar. James felt the ground shift. "Noah, come here," the nurse said softly, leading the boy by the hand. "Noah." The name echoed. James couldn't look away. The boy had his gaze, his closed-off posture, the same way of cautiously scanning the room before speaking. "You're the boy's father, right?" The nurse's question exploded silently inside him. James didn't reply. He didn't know. Or maybe he did. Hours later, Olivia remained unconscious. James sat in the cold corridor, blazer folded across his lap, trying to organize the storm in his mind. Time rewound. Memories came in waves. He and Olivia had been intense, young, passionate, unbearable to each other and yet inseparable. They had been married for 2 years when, out of nowhere, she asked for a divorce. Said she had to leave, disappeared, refused to argue. She just vanished from his life. James buried it. He drowned himself in work, told everyone she didn't deserve him, that she was unstable. But deep down, something had never quite added up. Now everything was beginning to crack open again. He pulled out his phone and called someone he trusted, Alexandra, his security chief and personal assistant. "I need information on Olivia Bennett. Everything. Where she lived, who she spoke to, records, photos. And I want to know who the father of her son is." Alexandra was surprised, but didn't question. He would obey. Across the hall, Noah was drawing on a pad of paper. The nurse said he didn't want to talk, but he had accepted juice and crayons. Clearly, he was a smart boy, quiet, observant, just like James had been at 8 years old. James approached carefully, sat on the bench beside him, silent. He looked at the drawing, a red car, 2 people inside. "Do you like cars?" he tried. Noah looked at him, serious, and replied, "I like helicopters better." Silence. "Your mom's going to be fine," James said. The boy didn't reply, but he looked at his face again, as if studying something he was trying to remember. Later, James was allowed into the ICU room. Olivia was hooked up to monitors but breathing on her own. He stood at her bedside for long minutes, stared at her with a mix of anger, pain, and something he hadn't felt in years: fear. "Why did you do this to me?" he whispered. "Why did you disappear like that?" She stirred. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips moved faintly. He leaned closer. "Olivia?" And then, almost like a breath, "I tried to protect him from your father." James froze. The echo of the phrase struck him like thunder. His whole body reacted. His father. Edward Mitchell. The man who controlled everything, who moved pieces across the high society chessboard as if they were puppets. He stumbled out of the room, looked at Noah in the hallway. The boy was watching him again, with the same inquisitive stare as before. Now James knew, or at least he felt it. Noah was his son, and something had gone terribly wrong in that separation. Something his own family never wanted him to discover. The next day dawned colorless. James had spent the night at the hospital, sleeping poorly in an uncomfortable armchair, while Olivia remained sedated and Noah slept in a makeshift little room. The nurse mentioned that the boy had cried softly before falling asleep, alone, clutching his mother's coat. James walked the hallways as if he were a stranger in his own skin. His son was there. 8 years, 8 stolen years, and he needed answers. Alexandra delivered the first files before 9 a.m. A discreet but thorough dossier, address, medical history, bank transactions, everything Olivia had done since leaving his life. One detail stood out. She had sent him several emails in the first months after their separation. Long, confused messages, but full of pain. They spoke of longing, of unspoken things, of something urgent. But none of them had reached his inbox. They had vanished along the way. James combed through the old server of his personal account, restored with Alexandra's help. The records were there, but the emails had been intercepted. All of them. "Someone tampered with this. Someone who had access to your private domain," Alexandra said cautiously. James replied only with a clenched jaw. With each new discovery, another thread of the web became visible. In the medical records of a prenatal clinic where Olivia had checkups in 2016, a name appeared as the legal guardian, Charles Foster. James had never heard of the man. He had Alexandra dig up everything on him. But the ID number was fake. The address, fabricated. The signature on the documents, a forgery. Charles Foster didn't exist. Or rather, he existed only on paper, like a shadow used to create distance between him and Olivia. That same afternoon, James went to his parents' mansion. The place where he had grown up now felt suffocating. The modern, imposing architecture, the garden trimmed with military precision. Everything carried the coldness of control his father always cultivated. Edward received him in the office. Margaret appeared minutes later, wearing a tense smile. "James, what a surprise. Is everything all right? I need to talk to you. Now." He didn't sit down. He stood like someone ready to flip the table if necessary. "Olivia was in an accident. She's alive. And she has a son. My son." Margaret raised a hand to her mouth. Edward frowned, but showed no surprise. "Is this serious?" Margaret whispered. "Very, and there's more. The name of a so-called Charles Foster appears in her medical records. Legal guardian. But this man doesn't exist." Edward crossed his arms. "And what does that have to do with us?" "Everything," James snapped. "The emails she sent me were intercepted, diverted. The domain was the company's, controlled by Mitchell Group's IT. Edward gave a short, humorless smile. "Is this a Noari, or just a late emotional crisis?" James stepped closer, eyes locked on his father. "It's a warning. I will uncover everything. And if you had a hand in this, I'll bury you with what I find." Edward didn't reply. Margaret tried to intervene, but James was already turning his back. The stench of lies was suffocating. On the way back to the hospital, a memory crashed over him. An old conversation, days before Olivia left. She had said, "Your father scares me, James. There are things in him you don't see." At the time, he thought she was exaggerating. Now, he wasn't sure of anything. Olivia was still asleep, but Noah was awake, sitting in a corner of the waiting room with a dinosaur book in his lap. James sat beside him, once more trying to break through the wall. "You like those? I used to like them too. T-Rex was my favorite." Noah didn't answer. "I know it's confusing, that you heard bad things about me. But I didn't know you existed. I swear." The boy lifted his eyes. "My mom said my dad left because he didn't want to be a dad." The words cut like a blade. James drew a deep breath. "She said that." "Not in those words. But she cried. I saw." Silence. "It's not your fault, Noah, or hers. It's mine, for not asking, for not fighting for her." The boy closed the book and stood. "She never wanted you to know. She said you lived in different worlds, that you were dangerous." And he walked away, alone, leaving James with his soul in pieces. The next day, a new lead fell into James's lap. Edward's retired secretary, Donna Mary, called him. She arranged a coffee outside the city. "I can't talk on the phone. They still watch everything," she said. When they met, she was nervous. Her hands trembled. "I should have said this years ago. I saw wrong things happening, heard conversations, documents being tampered with. Your father, he knew about the pregnancy. He had Olivia investigated, said she was a risk to the family plan." "What plan?" "I don't know details, but he spoke with a lawyer about removing the problem before it grew." James felt nauseous. And this Charles Foster? Made up by them, a name used to sign papers, to hide records. It was their way of keeping Olivia under control without involving your name. Why didn't she go to the police? Mary lowered her eyes. Because she knew what the Mitchell family was capable of. Back at the hospital, James entered Olivia's rented apartment. A simple space, but full of life. Colorful paintings, children's books, photos of Noah on every wall. He searched for something that could explain more. Found a cardboard box locked under the bed. Inside, old photos, and a letter with his name on the front. "James, if you're reading this, it means everything I feared has happened." His hands trembled as he read. The letter detailed the fear Olivia felt after the separation, the veiled threats, the disappearance of a friend who had helped her with pregnancy exams, the gut feeling they were being watched. And then, the last paragraph. "I installed a camera, hidden in the living room lamp. If anything happens to me, everything will be there." James rushed back to the apartment, his heart pounding. And there it was, disguised in the corner lamp. He removed the memory card, slid it into his laptop. On the videos, men breaking into the apartment while Olivia was gone, rifling through drawers. One of them wearing a badge with the Mitchell Foundation logo, the same logo he had seen for years, stamped as a symbol of social commitment, now a symbol of rot that ran deep and far too close to him. James felt as though he was peeling away layer after layer of his own family, and what lay beneath was rotten. The footage from the hidden camera left no doubt. Two men, both wearing Mitchell Foundation badges, had broken into Olivia's apartment. One even opened the closet where Noah kept his toys. They searched everything, took nothing. Just observed, noted, recorded, and disappeared. But now James knew where to go. The Mitchell Foundation for Children at Risk was the family's humanitarian jewel. Created in the 1990s by Edward, the project was celebrated by artists, politicians, and business leaders as a model of social responsibility. They had awards, international partnerships, heartwarming campaigns with smiling children, and slogans like "transforming lives" splashed across billboards. James had never cared much. He knew it polished the company's image, helped with tax exemptions, and filled the exemplary institution space in the headlines. But now, he saw the other side. He demanded internal access to the foundation's data, using his last name as a master key. And when he cross-checked adoption records with federal tax databases, he found the first crack. Names that disappeared, children legally adopted, and then erased from the system. Identities changed, new last names. Passports issued with unusual speed, 24 cases in 10 years. James stared at the screen for minutes, his stomach churning. He picked up the phone and called Alexandra. "Find someone in investigative journalism, someone who's already tried to bring down this foundation. I need someone who's seen the dirt." Alexandra hesitated. "I know one, David Turner, but his name's been blacklisted for years. They tried to crush him every way possible." "That's exactly who I want." Finding David was harder than expected. He lived in seclusion, writing freelance pieces under pseudonyms. He had been fired from 2 major outlets after publishing articles about suspicious adoptions involving elite foundations. James met him in a discreet bar that smelled of smoke and fried food. David had a scruffy beard, dark circles under his eyes, and a wary gaze. But when James said the name Olivia Bennett, he froze. "I thought she was dead." "She almost was. She's in a light coma. And she has a son." "My son." David studied him as if testing his sincerity. "Do you know what that foundation really does?" James nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand." David pulled a worn folder from his backpack, handed it to James carefully. "It's not just adoption trafficking. It's social engineering, selection, genetic profiles. They shape the children to become what wealthy parents want: obedient heirs, little CEOs, child diplomats. Each child is a project." James flipped through the pages. Documents, reports, psychological profiles of minors, all cold, technical, as if they were merchandise in testing phase. "And where does my son fit into this?" David hesitated. Noah was one of the targets. Ideal genetic profile. Above average intelligence, clean family history, healthy mother, no chronic illnesses. But Olivia slipped off the radar. Vanished for 8 years. They only managed to track her again recently. The floor seemed to shift beneath James's feet. They were going to take him? They were going to mold him, strip away her name, give him another last name, another story. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Back in his private office at home, James dug into old foundation files stored in the group's internal backups. He combed through hours of protocol-recorded meetings until he found what he was looking for. In a video from 7 years earlier, his father's voice, clear as glass. "Olivia Bennett still represents a risk. She knows too much. Keep her under surveillance, but keep her quiet. I don't want noise, no scandal. If she resists, we'll handle it legally. And the boy? He has potential. We'll monitor him. If the situation evolves, we'll request guardianship through the foundation. Discreetly, of course." James hit pause. He couldn't breathe for a few seconds. His father had known. His father had orchestrated everything, planned it, executed it, like a business contract. He stood, pacing in circles. He had to act, but he couldn't make mistakes. Olivia was still vulnerable, Noah even more so. He had to expose it, but with proof, with strength, with a strategy. 2 days later, David introduced him to other pieces of the puzzle. Former foundation employees, ex-lawyers from the group, families who suspected the whereabouts of their adopted children. All had stories, traumas, fear. James listened, took notes, filed everything away. In a moment of silence, David asked, Are you really willing to fight this? Against your own blood? James answered without hesitation. They stopped being my family the moment they treated my son like a product. At the hospital, Olivia opened her eyes. It took her time to recognize her surroundings. The light was too white, the sounds muffled. But when she saw James sitting beside her, eyes red with exhaustion, she tried to move. He held her hand gently. "You're safe. I'm here." She tried to speak, but no voice came out. James lowered his head as if wordlessly apologizing. "I saw the footage. I know what my father did to you. To us." A tear slid from the corner of her eye. "I tried to run, Rafa. I just wanted to protect him." "And you did. But now it's my turn." James left the hospital with a single goal in mind. Destroy the foundation, expose everything, protect Olivia, and never again let them touch Noah. What had started as a personal investigation was now a larger mission. The truth was out there, the filth exposed, but it still needed to explode. And for the first time in his life, James didn't want profit. He wanted justice. The silence of the mansion felt calculated. James walked in unannounced, his gaze hard, his steps firm. Every painting on the walls, every imported piece of furniture now seemed like props in a stage designed to conceal crimes. Edward was waiting in the office, as if he knew this encounter had been inevitable. Seated behind a dark wooden desk, he wore the same suit as always, the same serene, controlled expression. James wasted no time. "I saw the video. I heard you talking about Olivia. About my son." As if they were numbers in a spreadsheet. Edward laced his fingers together. "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment." "No, the truth. You manipulated everything. Pretended to care about family, but acted like an executioner." "Why?" Edward leaned forward. "Because you never had the stomach to understand how the world really works. Believing love and justice shape society is naive. We shape society, James, with hard decisions, with strategy. You destroyed lives, traumatized children. I saved children, gave them future, discipline, purpose. There is no legacy without sacrifice." James felt anger rise like fire in his chest. "You stole my son from me. You would have failed him, just as you failed everything that demanded more than goals and money. I did what was necessary." James stepped closer, eyes burning. "I am no longer the son you molded, and I will end all of this." Edward only smiled. "Then let the war begin." That same week, James and David set up a temporary base in a discreet co-working space downtown. The walls were lined with evidence, altered records, hidden camera footage, interviews with former Foundation employees, documents leaked by anonymous sources. It was more than corruption. It was human engineering. Children turned into luxury products for wealthy families under the disguise of charitable adoption. The whole of Brazil would be shaken if this came out. And it would. They were preparing the dossier for public release, a press conference with independent media, live streaming on social networks, everything timed down to the minute. "We just need one more piece," David said, "something that directly ties Edward to the identity transfers." Meanwhile, in the mansion, Margaret happened to overhear a conversation between Edward and the Foundation's lawyer. She stood behind the door when she heard Olivia's name and the term damage control. She froze, took a deep breath, heard Edward give the order. "If that woman opens her mouth, Olivia dies, and the boy goes where he should have gone from the start." Margaret recoiled in shock. The mask fell away. It wasn't just a cold project, it was a crime, and her silence for years had been part of it. Later, she went to the hospital alone. Olivia was awake but weak. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "Forgive me for not listening to you, for not protecting you when you begged." Olivia didn't answer, but her eyes spoke for her. Margaret pulled an envelope from her purse. "I kept this years ago. I thought I was protecting James. Today I know I was only obeying the wrong man." Inside the envelope, confidential documents, fake authorizations, a printed email exchange between Edward and a federal judge. Olivia closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. "He said if I didn't disappear, he'd make it look like I was mentally unstable, that I'd be committed, that I'd lose my son. I had no choice." Margaret touched her hand. "Now you do. Now we do." At the hospital, Noah already seemed like a different boy. The change was subtle. After watching James confront one of the infiltrated security guards, one of the very men caught in the lamp recordings, something shifted. The boy saw his father fight the man, shout at the hospital staff, demand reinforced security, protect, defend, fight for them. And for the first time, Noah called him Dad, softly, as if testing the sound of the word. "Dad, you're going to stay here, right?" James knelt beside him. "Until the end. And after, too." The next morning, David arrived agitated. "We've got a problem. A federal judge just issued an arrest warrant against me, claiming intellectual property invasion of Mitchell Foundation." James froze. "That's Edward. He's trying to silence us through the courts. I need to leave the city, but the press conference is set. You'll have to go on without me, for now." James embraced him. "You'll be back, with honor, with everything cleared." Hours later, James visited Olivia again. She was more lucid, strong, despite the pain. "Tell me everything. From the beginning?" he asked. She nodded. "After I left you, I tried to stay in touch, but your emails vanished. One day, I found a card left by a man calling himself Charles, an assistant to your father. He said you didn't want to hear from me, or the child, that if I tried to interfere with your career, he'd destroy me. And you believed him? I saw the power of your family. One day, my account was frozen. Another day, a court officer came to my door with a fake summons. I started hiding, moved cities, then changed names. When Noah was born, I swore he'd stay out of your reach." James lowered his head. He knew part of the blame was his, for being blind, for never asking. "I won't fail you again." She looked at him. "Then finish this. It'll be public. Huge. They won't be able to run. Don't forget who you are, James. Don't become like him." He smiled painfully. "For the first time, I think I know who I am." In the dead of night, James entered the Foundation's building with a special warrant, authorized by a judge David trusted. Inside, he accessed the central server, connected an external hard drive, copied everything: videos, contracts, files, bank transactions. In the middle of the night, he received a call. It was Margaret. "I'm inside your father's office. He's asleep. I found a safe." "What's in it?" "Letters, documents, dossiers, including ones about you, James, since childhood. Take everything. The world is going to see who he really is." On the other end, Margaret took a deep breath. "I should have done this long ago." James didn't reply. He knew the weight of a lifetime had just fallen on her shoulders. But now, finally, all the knots were tightening, and soon they would snap. The main hall of the Mitchell Foundation was decorated with luxury and hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers, red carpet, children smiling on giant screens, rehearsed speeches. The Foundation's annual ceremony was being broadcast live across the country. Journalists, business leaders, and politicians were in attendance, all wearing the same mask of philanthropy. James watched it all from the shadows, positioned with David and the embedded technical team. The videos, audios, documents, everything was ready. The plan was simple and bold: interrupt the ceremony at its peak, seize control of the broadcast, and expose the truth nationwide. At 8:07 p.m., Edward walked onto the stage. The audience rose to its feet in applause. He smiled, made a gesture of false humility, and began to speak about commitment to the future of children. That was when James stepped in. He climbed the stairs to the stage in silence, under confused stares. Stopped next to his father, snatched the microphone from his hand, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the foundation you are celebrating tonight is a fraud." Silence, then whispers. Edward tried to grab his arm, but James pulled away. "My name is James Mitchell, and today I'm here to expose the truth about the network of illegal adoptions, identity trafficking, and child manipulation run by my father, and by many of those sitting in this audience." The screens changed. Images began to play, footage from hidden cameras, recorded conversations, falsified profiles, faces of missing children. Backstage, David coordinated the broadcast while the Foundation's technical team tried to stop it. But it was already too late. The content was being mirrored on dozens of alternative channels. The signal was out of control. James pointed at his father. "This man stole my son, tried to erase his mother from history, and did the same with dozens of other families, all to feed the ego and the pockets of a rotten elite." The audience was in shock. Some stood to leave. Others filmed with their phones. Edward tried to take the microphone back, but was blocked by a security guard who had already switched sides. Across the city, Olivia was watching from a protected room. Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand. The transmission now showed official reports, forged signatures, offshore bank transactions. Margaret, pale, stood up. "I need to go." "Go do what?" Olivia asked. Margaret clutched her purse firmly. "Tell my part of the story." Minutes later, the journalist overseeing the broadcast announced a surprise guest live. Margaret Mitchell appeared on the giant screen, nationwide, before microphones and cameras. "My name is Margaret Mitchell. I am Edward's wife, James's mother. And for years, I turned a blind eye to things I now know were crimes. Enough. I refused to die an accomplice." She revealed what she knew, confirmed documents, spoke of secret meetings, bribes, judges bought off. The nation watched in shock. The fall of the Mitchell Foundation had begun, and nothing could stop it. With the broadcast still live, James heard David in his earpiece. "Red alert. We've detected movement near the hospital. Unauthorized access attempt." James went pale. Noah. He ran off the stage without a goodbye. The exposure was done. Now he had to protect his family. At the hospital, a man in a suit and a doctor's badge tried to enter the ward where Noah slept, but he was intercepted by Alexandra, James's trusted security chief, already on alert. "Lost, buddy?" Alexandra asked, blocking the doorway. The intruder tried to push through, but was taken down in seconds. Civil police, pre-warned, arrived at the right moment. The man carried fake documents and a device for cloning ID badges. James arrived minutes later. He entered the room and found Noah awake, frightened, Olivia hugging him tightly. "It's all right now. No one's going to take you from me," James said, kneeling beside his son. The boy's breathing was fast, his eyes wet. "I thought you weren't coming back." James smiled, eyes filled with tears. "I will always come back." Noah stared at him for a moment, and for the first time, without fear, he said, "Dad." The word rang firm. True, a bond finally restored. That same night, Edward tried to flee, boarding a private jet with forged documents. But he was intercepted on the runway, handcuffed, surrounded by cameras and protesters. "You don't understand," he shouted as he was dragged away. "I did all this to protect the country from chaos. I'm an architect, a strategist." But the country no longer wanted false heroes. It wanted justice. James went home with Noah asleep in his arms. Olivia, still shaken, held his hand in the back seat. Brazil was in flames, headlines, debates, open investigations. But inside that car there was silence and peace, at least for a moment. The next morning, James received an anonymous envelope. Inside, a single printed phrase: "He fell, but the legacy lives on. Watch the name, George Andrews." James crushed the paper in his hand. The war wasn't over. It had only changed its face. The sun rose slowly, its warm light filtering through the simple curtains of the new house. James was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee in his hands, his eyes lost in the landscape he now called home. It was a modest house, in the countryside of Los Angeles, surrounded by trees and silence. Nothing there resembled the skyscrapers, the glass offices, or the million-dollar meetings, and that was exactly what he wanted. After the fall of the Mitchell Foundation, Edwards' arrest, and the public exposure of the entire network, James made quick decisions. He sold his shares in the group, dissolved his participation in the family companies, and transferred much of the capital to create a reparation fund. The money would now serve to find and support the victims of the system his family had helped build. It was the first time James signed a contract and felt he was building something real. On television, the news still echoed the downfall of the foundation. Headlines read, "The heir who became a whistleblower," "The fall of an elite family," "The new symbol of civil justice." James appeared in interviews but refused praise. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I only did what I should have done from the beginning." He declined invitations to public office, committees, NGO boards. "My mission now has a first and last name. His name is Noah." Margaret now lived under federal protection. She had moved south to a small, discreet town. She became an official whistleblower in the case and provided valuable information about the foundation's allies, helping dismantle the financial arm of the network. She and James exchanged short messages once or twice a week. Their relationship was cautious, but alive. There were still wounds, but also something he once thought impossible: empathy. Olivia was starting to live again. Little by little, she returned to writing. Her old passion for literature, buried by years of fear and flight, now blossomed in the quiet afternoons of the new house. She set up a small library in one of the rooms. She wrote children's stories, many inspired by Noah. Stories about courage, truth, and boys who defeated invisible monsters. And Noah now smiled. He played in the yard with a worn-out ball, talked to the birds, created universes out of sticks and dirt. Sometimes, in the middle of playing, he would stop, look up at the sky, and ask questions about the stars. He was curious, creative, intense, just as James had once been before the world molded him into hardness. But now, James would not let the world mold his son. Not anymore. One afternoon, while they were painting together on the porch, Noah asked, "Dad, is Grandpa Edward going to stay in prison forever?" James didn't answer right away. He rinsed the brush in water and replied calmly, "I don't know, maybe not. But the most important thing is that now he can't hurt anyone anymore." "Not even you?" "Not even me." Noah nodded, understanding more than he should at just 8 years old. "Were you angry at him?" "I was. Very. But I learned that we can turn anger into something else, into courage, into love." "And did you?" James smiled. "I'm trying. Every day." The name George Andrews resurfaced in confidential reports. David, now editor of an independent investigative news outlet, kept James informed. George was an old partner of Edwards and seemed to be rebuilding part of the network through international fronts. But James refused to be consumed. "One thing at a time," he told David in a call. I won't lose myself again. Today, my priority lives here, is 8 years old and paints dinosaurs with tempera paint. On an ordinary evening, Noah played in the yard, chasing soap bubbles carried away by the wind. James watched from the porch, with Olivia sitting beside him, laughing softly. The sky was painted orange, the earth smelled of recent rain. The rescued dog from the shelter slept at their feet. James took a deep breath. There was a silent peace in that moment that no past success had ever given him. He thought of everything he had left behind: the profits, the titles, the dinners with ministers, the headlines with his name, and he thought of what he had now, the chance to watch his son grow free, safe, whole. A tear slid down his cheek, unhurried. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. He hadn't saved the entire world, but he had saved his son's world, and for him, that was true success. And you? What did you think of this story? If this story moved you, leave a comment. Love is courage. Give it a like and subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll help this message reach even more people who also need to hear about courage, love, and justice.